Well, welcome to our Meet Your Instructor program through the Duluth Art Institute. Anybody who's familiar with the Duluth Art Institute knows that a big part of what we do revolves around teaching the craft of art, teaching the philosophy of art, and teaching our community how to engage with the people around them through their art. So it was important for us to start to highlight some of these artists in the community that not only share the work that they do, but who also go out of their way to spend time with artists and teach them the crafts that they've spent learning all these years and teaching the next generation of creators, whether it's a room full of energetic kids at a summer camp or it's our artistic peers and we're just teaching them a really refined and specialized skill that we just learned. So it really runs the whole spectrum from beginner to expert. And it's just really great to highlight the artists who not only spend time teaching it, but there's a lot of preparation that goes into preparing for these classes, and that's work in and of itself. And we really appreciate that, and we really appreciate the thoughtfulness that goes into it. So our first guest for this series is one of our most active instructors, Lynn Rose. Welcome, Lynn.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you've taught probably 10, 15, 20 classes in the last year. Maybe
Yeah,
more
all things.
sessions than that. It's been pretty busy. You stayed really busy and taught a lot of artists for like you the summer camp, and then you recently were teaching the Teen Open Studio. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Introduce yourself, kind of the art that you make, what you do.
Yeah, so I'm a painter in Duluth, and I'm primarily a children's illustrator. I've always been kind of drawn to storytelling. I have been an artist that has focused on on ink for years and years. And oh gosh, about a decade ago, I really started picking up watercolor. So I have been teaching watercolor and drawing for some years now. Um, Usually in kind of like the fantasy themed elements.
Really big into fantasy art. It's a theme that I've seen in your work, and of course, I'll pull up a little slideshow of some of your pieces here in a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about why you love watercolor so much?
So part of why I love watercolor is that it's so versatile. I have experimented with several mediums, and nothing has really brought me the highs and the lows as watercolor really has. I enjoy watercolor because it's a semi-permanent medium. Like the reason why it's always behind glass is because it can still be altered even after its completion. Because it can mix with water, it can be lifted, it can be fixed up. So if I look at my piece from, say, years ago and I say, I don't really like how that came out, I can pick it back up and I can still work on it and I can continue to push it even further than say I did at the place that I was when I had created it.
Absolutely. Can you think offhand how like what the biggest gap between putting a piece down and picking it back up and noodling with it again?
Oh, 8 years has been my biggest gap. I actually have a stack of several unfinished paintings. I do finish paintings, but I have children at home and I'm busy. I start, I go, I stop. I'll have an idea and then I'll go back to it. Recently, I dug through my refuse pile of artwork and I pulled it out and I started working on it again. And it's kind of cool to see how much I've changed throughout those years, but I can still go back to it anytime I want.
That's great. Yeah, I know that that's a medium that certainly you can take things you've learned, or even looking back at it, maybe there's something in there that you like that you didn't like at the time. And sometimes with time, we learn to appreciate certain parts of our work that we didn't before. So that's great. So I know that for myself, and I have heard it from other artists as well that don't regularly practice watercolor, is that it can be feel a little intimidating because it does not behave the same way that like a pencil does or a marker or a brush with ink. Can you tell us a little bit about what are some of the things that scare beginners coming into watercolor, and maybe tell us how you embrace the challenge of mastering those things or overcoming that fear?
I think a big part of what might intimidate new learners is about the setup and what you need. There are so many different options online. Say, for example, if you want to paint outside, everyone has their own unique setup. So honestly, a big hurdle is starting the research on your own and you dig and you find a million different answers. Um, so the biggest hurdle is probably getting the tools that you need and knowing where to start, and being okay with making mistakes because it can be a very frustrating medium if you start it without any direction. As I found out, definitely when I started watercolor in, oh, this isn't going to work, in my sketchbook uh, about a decade ago. And it was the wrong paper and it was the wrong paint. And all it did was buckle and warp. And I was intimidated and I left it alone for a while. So I think a good way to start is to have a few like key essentials like your brush, certain kind of watercolor. Are you going to use panels? Are you going to use tubes? Are you going to use sticks? And what kind of paper? And those are the things that I think people would really benefit from knowing before they start. And then the rest is history.
Yeah, once you have the tools, maybe the most challenging part is to finally actually use them because we all know that artists love to go shopping for new supplies
Oh,
and,
yeah.
and adding to their collection. I think that's part of the passion of making art. But yeah, you eventually have to jump in and take that first step into the new medium. So do you remember the first time that you put marker or not marker, but paint to paper with watercolors?
The correct way or the incorrect way?
Either or, pick your poison, I guess.
I remember the very first painting I did, and it was on the wrong paper. And I remember every single detail and each color I used because it was a big moment to get away from just using graphite in a sketchbook. I had always been in sketchbooks, and I remember that feeling. But when I used the correct paper, though, that experience was entirely different and much more positive because I was able to play with it with the way that it's intended to be with water. Watercolor paper holds a lot of water,
Mhm.
and I could play. I don't actually remember the composition I did in that one. I think because it was such a positive experience.
That's good.
Um, yeah.
Well, we have talked a little bit about the work, your journey to starting it, and we've talked a little bit about some of the basics of starting watercolor in general. I wanted to pull up some of your work and some of the work that inspired you, and I don't have it in any particular order here, but I wanted to just give you like a minute with each of these images to share kind of what your mindset was. So I'm gonna screen share your art, and we're just gonna click through and land on what we end up with. All right. So this here, we're starting with this one because it's my favorite. But can you tell us a little bit about what this piece is called, when you did it, a little bit more about it?
So this piece is called Above Superior. The lake reoccurs in several of my paintings. I'm very drawn to it. It's part of what brought me to Duluth. This piece I completed after doing a portion of the Superior hiking trail. One of the experiences I had had solo hiking was when the woods just parted and I could see the lake and I could see the hills and the ridges and the big cedars. I wanted to capture that in this image and in the style that influenced me. My earliest influence was early animation. This for some viewers might see a similarity between this and the early Hobbit movie from the 1970s, where it's heavily stylized, but there's watercolor backgrounds.
Mhm. Wonderful. I love the way that just the composition. I like that there's so much depth to it, even though the colors they kind of are all pretty bold, but I just like how it doesn't feel flat, even though there's kind of bold colors on every plane here. I think that's something that breaks the rules, but at the same time, it works. I think it's great. So wonderful work here. That's why I like it. So this one here, can you tell us about this one?
So this style is completely different from the style that we just looked at. This one is me painting from life. I have a little apple tree in my backyard, and this painting took roughly an hour painting outside. My setup is different from when I'm inside, and I'm in much more of a hurry. And working with watercolor is working in an air of chaos. It's like working in a state of emergency, but once you can harness it and sort of predict what's going to happen, you can really make it look pretty exciting. So in here, I did a quick wash in the background, and then I just threw paint on and threw paint on. I forgot to take my time, but I think it worked out all right in the end.
All right. Yeah, the it's jarring to go from the last one to this one, but it's great that you still managed to give it a different energy, even though you're not leaning into color so much. All right. So this is one of your influences, right?
Yes, this is a close friend of mine, Devon Lawrence. I actually have this painting. I purchased it from him a few years ago. He is one of my favorite watercolor painters. He's very humble. He probably would say, "Nah, I'm not all that." But I have looked at and studied his work for a number of years, and he's actually the reason why I use the watercolor brand that I use, Daniel Smith Watercolors. It's very highly pigmented. You don't need a lot of paint. In this painting, Devon is using paint somewhat thickly in some spaces, which is something you can do with Daniel Smith, and you can work very lightly. And the colors all have a very broad range. And as you can see here, there's heavy contrast in some spots, and then there's some gradients in others. This is all watercolor, and it has a lot of graphic art strength, as fine, for lack of better words.
Yeah, very bold, very, yeah, exactly. I really like the way you described it. All right, on to the next one. Looks like the same artist. Come on.
This is the same artist. This is also Devon's work. He paints a variety of things. Some of my favorites are his animals. And in this one, I chose this one because there are a lot of things that screams danger. You could mess up if you do this. So it to me, it shows a great level of skill and control. Let's say the yellows and the blacks, though I'm not sure if he's using black or not. Not all artists use the color black. They'll mix several colors to make a black light color. So in here, where there was potential for mistakes, like the black running and smudging, it looks to me like there was a lot of heavy planning. And he took his time with it, which it's hard to do with watercolor. I'm not a patient person, so I will try and get it done as quick as possible before it's dry. So this looks like it was heavily methodical and well thought out.
All right, and we can talk a little bit about planning. I know that's part of your lesson plan is pl how to plan and think about your work
Yes.
before you start. So I'm glad that you touched on that. All right, on to the next one here. This is a piece that I recognized because I wanted to use this as the banner for Open Studio, Wednesday night Open Studio. Can you quickly tell us, just in like a minute, about Wednesday night Open Studio? I really attribute that program to you and your initiative to come to me when I first started in this role a year and a half ago. I still remember you showing up and visiting and talking about your vision for this program, and now it's grown immensely since we first started a year and a half ago. Can you tell us about Open Studio?
Yeah, so Open Studio is sort of a casual space where artists can come in and chat and make art. In virtually any medium, there's definitely no barriers. We don't say, "Ugh, no, you're an oil painter, you can't come in here." But yeah, it's a chill space for people to come in. We do light critique of each other's work towards the end, with enough time to return to your work, to work on things that were suggested. It's completely optional. You don't have to, even share your work at all. But yeah, Wednesday night open studios, come in, make art. It's a great laid back space, and that's what my vision was, and how it's remaining.
Yeah, it looks like that's us from Open Studio there, huh?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah. Even my kids are in there. They'll occasionally visit. So
That's fun. So, what's going on with this piece?
so this piece, about 3 years ago, I went on a mission to go and find lady slippers throughout the state. And I had realized that there were actually different varieties of lady slippers, and this one is the showy lady slipper. I grew up all over the country, but I am from Minnesota, and my strongest memory as a child is the lady slipper. They're everywhere. So I made it my mission to go and find them and to make a painting of it. I wanted to show just an array of them in kind of a swampy, wet area, but to add my fantasy element to it. So I had little fairies walking through it, and it's kind of difficult to really see them right away, and that's intentional. When you're walking through a forest on a trail, you might see glittering in the leaves and the foliage. And to me, it looks like little fairies. So when you look harder, you can see it, but otherwise they're somewhat blending in.
Yeah, I think that's great. Like they're visible enough where I don't think anybody would look at this and completely miss them, but you have to
Mhm.
like, you have to pull in, which I think is a great, you're doing a great job of guiding the viewer and almost pulling our face closer to the canvas or to our phone screen or wherever we see this because we're like, what's going on there? Like there's something that looks familiar, but I can't quite tell from a distance. So I think that's a really great composition choice and a great, just a decision to hold back on certain details and stuff. So I like that one. That was a favorite of mine early on. All right, next one.
So this painting I had recently done of my son outside with a little chickadee. We like to bird watch in our little bird feeders at the house, and the chickadee is a favorite with my kids. So one morning we went outside and he threw his coat on and he wanted to show me his flute that he could play his flute. So I took a photograph of him and I turned it into a painting with him outside in the snow with my favorite colors that show in winter, those pink skies and those oranges and those very light blues of the snow.
And we're starting to look at maybe some of your recent work with that background there. I think
Mhm.
your work is starting to develop like a little bit of a world, and that those trees back there are like a little precursor to what you have going on, at least in the work that you've done at the end of this last year. So I really like that. I think it's cool. All right, so this is a little smaller. I apologize. It's showing up really tiny. But can you tell us about this piece here? It looks like a
So
lake.
this piece is from a local artist who passed away a few years ago. He grew up along the North Shore, I believe, from Isle Royale, and he came from a family of fishers. His name is Howard Sivertson. He's got a few books published about the fur trade out here, and he is one of my influences locally. I thought it would be important to share that just because of the local vibe. And I really appreciate um, his vision of history and how he captures it. It's very it's like Winslow Homer in a sense. I can tell that he studied him. We have a few of his images in here as well.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to scroll down to the next one here.
This is also Howard Sivertson. I really see. I picked this image because it showed the painterly style of watercolor and how it can bleed, and how he controlled the bleeding of the watercolor in the background where it looks a little bit like the Northern Lights, an abstracted background behind the trees. Those are some effects that are very exclusively watercolor.
Hmm.
The bleeding onto the paper, the running, the dripping look. And I had picked this because I thought, well, it is not overly done. It is done very tactfully, and it does not overpower the image.
I like this piece because at first I didn't know if it was Northern Lights or if it was like a really tall, like cliffside or something like that. So I really like the depth that backdrop uh, gives it for sure. I think it's a really great contrast of those leaves on the trees and then that really dark background. So I really like it. All right. This is a throwback.
Oh, an extreme throwback to the Ming Dynasty, or actually, no, I think this was the Song. But this was around the 5th and 6th century. Very, very early watercolor. I want to include this because so in my educational background, I went to school initially for photography, and then I went for Asian studies, Chinese studies, and I focused on Chinese for my major. And it kind of intersected with my interests in the arts, in the sense that, so Chinese art for years and years and years, this is called san shui painting. It's mountain water painting. It's from the imagination. It is not from a certain scene. It's from the mind. It's a very meditative thing. They usually worked with ink sticks and a brush that's very close to a watercolor brush today that we use. I think that watercolor has not been taken very seriously in the Western sphere, but it has for a very long time in Asia.
Very good. I don't know too much about the history of watercolor, but uh, it's not surprising that it's been mastered and it's a kind of a timeless medium. And some of those mediums have their moment in the sun, and other times they are kind of a little more obscure. And from what you're saying, it sounds like in the last couple 100 years, watercolor has had its place, and it's not necessarily elevated at the top of the chain of art. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of the artists that we'll be looking at too, um, they were from the U.S. In the last few hundred years, and they would use watercolor as sort of a graph or a draft for oil painting. So it was
Oh,
seen
okay.
as a temporary thing, a fundamental thing to build for a quote unquote serious painting.
Okay, that's interesting. So I'm starting to draw connections to other forms of art that are seen as that go-between. So I can totally understand what you're saying now, for sure. All right, cool. Let's scroll to the next one. This looks like watercolor, right?
Yes. So this is Winslow Homer, American painter. His body of works were mostly oil, but his watercolors, they were usually plein air, meaning that they were on location. Watercolor is designed to be portable, and that is precisely why he took that with him. He went fly fishing, and he would paint people fly fishing. And part of why I liked this image is because of the drama of the lighting. And that's something really special about watercolor is capturing the light or the absence of it. And in here, just the white of the paper that's left tells you just enough to know that the water is somewhat turbulent, and it's still defined as water, even though it's very abstracted and quickly painted.
Mhm. I really like the way that it leads us away, and he's or whoever this person on the boat is, they were we can kind of tell where they're headed, and it looks a little ominous, but not so much. It's not like the boat is like struggling. It's not like the boat is struggling or anything, or there's waves chopping or anything like that. So it's an interesting balance of ominous and like calm and serene at the same time.
Yeah.
All right, got another one here.
Again, this is Winslow Homer with the fly fish painting, and it's very quickly done, but it looks easy. And when a painter makes it look easy, that means that they're very highly skilled at what they're doing. Because I've
Hmm.
tried doing some master copies of his work, and I'll tell you, it's very difficult to do. And again, I really appreciate the drama that he captures in this image. There's just enough of the hills in the background to tell you that there is terrain, and there's just enough water to tell you the story of the person in the boat. It's a calm morning. They're fishing. You can almost hear it.
Yes, it looks very realistic the way that it was executed. Very, very strong edges of the different colors and planes. It's not really washed out. So it's very vivid. It's very and that water, it makes the water look crystal clear. It's great.
Yes. So this is a watercolor piece by John Singer Sargent, very famous portrait painter in the Americas. Uh, This painting I had picked because it just looks so calm and so serene, and it's a very limited palette, which is something that I'll also be teaching in this course about how to control your palette. Because he's using a limited palette, it's easier for the viewer to pick out shapes. It's not monochromatic. There isn't too much going on. It's very easy to get lost in color, and it can delay decision making if the right colors aren't picked out. So working from a limited palette can really help you to focus on your composition. And this is actually a crop of the original painting. It's kind of difficult to find online. But yeah, John Singer Sargent was definitely a master of light, and certainly of composition. And again, he was an oil painter. He used watercolor for, planning for his oil paintings, but some of his watercolors could certainly stand alone as a finished work.
All right, wonderful.
So this is John Singer Sargent was a part of an era of eroticizing Orientalism, but some of his paintings were just so beautiful from his travels in Northern Africa. And this was titled The Bedouin People. I really appreciated the blue that he had used. It might actually have been in Morocco, but I could be wrong. I picked this image a bit randomly from his watercolors, but I really appreciated the works from his travels and the bravery that he had with dry brushing, which is another thing that we'll go over in the class. So the very grainy texture that you can see around their clothing, that's from dry brush. That's from just taking wet paint and just putting it directly onto the paper without the paper being wet.
I love that look. That's just a design choice that I just find to be really appealing aesthetically. Even now, like like even in the digital sphere, people are trying to find that digital brush that gives that dry brush feel.
Yeah. And this is another one. I had briefly mentioned about capturing light or the absence of it. And John Singer Sargent certainly knew how to capture light. And you can kind of tell that there is a harsh light coming right through the window onto the sleeping person. And one of the things that makes watercolor special about this painting looks quick, but it probably wasn't. Looking at his forehead, about how it kind of blends into the pillow and you can still separate the shape. That's something that is a lot of fun to play with watercolor, is that the blending and leaning into the abstract that it gives you, and defining or even leaving a space not defined. So this picture is by another friend of mine in Hampton Roads, Virginia, Rowena Finn. Her nickname is Ro, so I'll refer to her as Ro. I believe that she works on hot press paper, and that's something I would like to teach as well, is the difference between papers when you are painting with watercolor. Hot press is wonderful for people who are working with flowers, with plants. It has a certain way of resisting a color, but at the same time absorbing a texture very quickly. I really appreciate this piece that Ro had done because I can tell it took a long time to do. It's very realistic, yet it's stylized. Her palette is very clean. It's a very busy piece, but when I look at it, it's not overwhelming.
No, it looks like that texture on there is just so soft. It looks great. It's very satisfying to look at.
Yes. This is another piece by Ro. So earlier, we showed a plein air painting that I had done of the blossom from my apple tree, and there's one behind my head right here. This is an apple blossom as well. So this is an example of difference of styles. Mine was plein air. I don't think that Ro did plein air for this. If she did, I am absolutely amazed. But I really appreciate the use of negative and positive space in this image. I like the composition so much. I appreciate that the pinks in here, the different busy shapes in here again with the busy, but it's also very controlled where it's not overwhelming and it's very light, while there's still very dark values in here. Um, I really appreciate this work because it tells me that there was a lot of time and planning that went into this piece. And having used hot press myself, I am always stunned by people who can master it. It is a very difficult kind of paper to work on because of the way that paint sits on it. But as you can see, the end result can potentially be stunning.
All right. This looks like is that the same one from before or is it different?
It might be a little different, but this is just another example of san shui painting. Again, with the waterfalls and the mountains, and the painters, they used their imagination. It was whatever pleased them. It was a meditative thing, and that's something I really appreciate about this. It's very free flowing, and the composition is always different from, say, how a person that, like, say, speaks English would, because they read left to right. So way back in ancient China, the way a person's eye would enter the page would be from right to left instead of left to right. So if you were to flip this horizontally, the entire feeling of the painting would change.
I think that's great. Yeah, I can totally see that for sure.
Oh, again with Winslow Homer, with the fly fishing.
All right. There's some of your work.
This is some of my work. So this was a recent piece that I did for my winter show in Cloquet. I wanted to capture again that soft lighting of winter and the starkness of a dark tree. These big towering Christmas trees or short Christmas trees. I love the short fat Christmas trees. But I wanted to capture the contrast between the snow and the dark shadows of the tree. I wanted specifically this tree, and I was not thinking about composition initially. So when I had gotten the tree on the page, I ended up using leading lines in the lower half of the composition to bring the eye up to the top in order to balance it so that it's not just sticking there flat and static.
I really like this piece. I remember when you were working on it. The flames in the foreground, they're more representational, but in the way that you're using the color palette, feel like total, like I would want to go up to them and put my hands together and kind of put my hands out to warm them up. So even though they look representational, they still look realistic in this universe that would be where I would go. I'd immediately gravitate toward those things.
Yeah.
All right. I think that might be the last one we have in the slideshow. So what I want to pivot to here to close things out is just hear from you a little bit about, I guess, what is some of your philosophies and your ideas about art in general? Like, what are the things that you like to think about when you're sitting down to get working on art? What does art mean to you?
That is a question that I will forever give a different answer to depending on my mood. Because
Yes, day
it's always
Monday, beginning
changing.
of the year. It's Monday, beginning of the week, January, beginning of the year. How are you feeling right now?
I'll consider giving a very hopeful answer for this one. My personal art philosophy is that I'm a life learner and that I will never stop learning. So oftentimes in, like, Wednesday night open studio or even during the day on Tuesday open studio, I will ask people questions about what they're using, how they're using it, and what their vision is behind it. And I'm always taking notes, constantly taking notes. My art philosophy is definitely centered around knowing that I don't know and that I will always change and I can never stagnate where I'm at. Otherwise, I won't grow. Um, I think that many artists could benefit from a perspective like that, but I have my own bias. I think it ties into the reason why I'm teaching. And I'm teaching because I believe that strong fundamentals really help an artist on their journey, especially deterring them from mistakes that, say, I might have made that would be frustrating, where they might hit a wall and say, I hate this. I don't want to do this anymore. I don't like how it feels. Yeah, so I think as an educator, I would apply that philosophy. It's you're always learning, you're always moving forward, always taking notes. You never know everything.
Absolutely. And I like what you said about taking notes because it's important to somehow document what we're thinking or our process, whether it's like videos or like a post on social media or just anything like that, because we can look back and sometimes there's lessons to be learned looking retroactively back at our work from years ago. Can you tell us about some of the lessons you've learned over the years about your work and how you view your work, maybe from like 5 to 10 years ago?
I think about 10 years ago, I was working only with inspiration. I had virtually no discipline and I was sporadic and I was all over the place. And then more recently, in the past few years, I have been focusing more on my vision and what that actually is, which is very difficult to find. It's kind of like studying philosophy, it all just becomes words eventually. Um, and I think that uh, I've been finding myself and my vision, and it's changed a lot over the years. My vision has really become a lot more cheerful than it was early on when it was just emotional and just inspiration, and now it's becoming more okay. How can this fit into this theme? How can it fit into that theme? And what would my audience think of it? Should I want them to think something? Do I want a message with this? And I hope that's an okay indirect answer.
Well, well, I think, and it's something that you almost have to, like you were saying, it depends on the day. And our philosophy around art is constantly evolving. I know that just probably last May, I can think that there were certain things that I thought about my work and goals that I had about my work that have changed since then. So I think it's constantly evolving. And again, that's why it's important. You can look back at this episode in 10 years and reflect on what your thoughts are now. And maybe they're the same. Maybe you've doubled down on your beliefs, or maybe you're like, oh, I don't know what I was thinking. But I mean, that's the nature of just documenting your thoughts. We're all trying to grow. We're all moving in a direction that sometimes has finds us leaving behind ideas and concepts that we once held as like universal truths. So, what can you share any final thoughts about your upcoming events or classes? I know that you have some stuff coming up this spring where you're going to be showcasing some of your work.
Yeah, actually. Like this is for the upcoming class in February, Introduction to Watercolor. We'll be covering like value studies, applications of watercolor, the different techniques of lifting, pulling, and adding layers. So my next show that I have coming up is going to be my last show for a while. I'm going to be focusing after this show on a completely different set of works and a different medium. So this show is at the Tetagooch Visitor Center at the Tetagooch State Park up the North Shore. It will be filling the visitor center for about a month in May. Opening night, I believe, is the 6th, but that might change. It will be based on my solo hike of the Superior Hiking Trail for the past, solo hikes for the past couple of years. So it'll be leaning more towards that illustrative style with ink and fantasy while using elements of the North Shore.
Well, Lynn, I really appreciate you taking time with us. I encourage all of our live attendees here to stick around for a couple minutes for a short Q&A. And for our future audience who is listening to this in podcast form or on YouTube, I just want to sign off. I want to thank you for listening. Thank you for checking out what we're doing. As always, our website, duluthartinstitute.org, has everything from a list of local artists. It importantly has a list of our upcoming classes. And it also has resources that we want to make available to everyone to find better ways to engage with the community. Here in Duluth, we have a really great community and a lot of artists who are willing to help new artists. We have experienced artists who have learned a thing or two over the years that are, again, happy to share what they've learned. And that's a big part of what we do at the Duluth Art Institute. So go ahead, check us out, duluthartinstitute.org. Lynn, where can we find your artwork?
You can find my artwork on Instagram under my art alias, Linnaea Borealis Rose.
All right. Well, thank you. Stick around to our live audience here, and we're signing off to our future audience. Thank you.
You.